there's stuff I could say about the scale of the national debt now being nowhere near as significant as it was at the end of the First World War or the Second World War, but I'll leave that for another lecture. However, just as now, this dramatic rise in the national debt has been used as the occasion, indeed the invitation, the excuse, however you want to phrase it, to install a whole series of austerity measures to cut back public spending. Okay? So after the First World War, there was an attempt to try and bring Britain back to the disciplines of Victorian liberal political economy. Okay? Now this produces a series of crises. The first crisis is in 1922 when the Geddes Act comes down. This is the act that brings the first big cuts in public expenditure. This is the point where unemployment begins to escalate, as we'll see shortly. This is the cut of a whole series of social programs like the housing program, construction of public housing that I was talking to you about last week. In 1924, our old friend Winston Churchill decides to put Britain back onto the gold standard. Britain had gone off the gold standard during the First World War. In 1924, they go back on, and they go back on trying to put the level of the pound at its pre-war market level, which was at almost $5. I think it was about $4.8 to the pound. And that's going to have a major crippling effect on the British export industries, as we'll see shortly. 1926, then the general strike, which is a response to the declining wages that have come in with the economic downturn after the war. And then finally, the financial crises of 1929 and 1931. Okay? Now, in 1931, this is a date that you must go to sleep thinking of. 1931 is the point in which Britain finally abandons the two most cherished elements of Victorian liberal political economy. The gold standard, Britain finally comes off the gold standard in 1931, and it abandons free trade. Okay? So the principles of economic management that had been in place from the 1840s are finally ended almost a century later. And you have the introduction of protection and a general tariff on goods of about 10% to begin with. Now, this has important consequences for the British economy. Okay? Because the gold standard, the return to the gold standard, massively inflates the value of the pound in trying to return to its pre-war levels. That suddenly prices British exports out of the market. Suddenly, British manufacturers find that they no longer have access to their old export markets because suddenly their goods have become twice as expensive overnight. Okay? So exports begin to fall precipitously. And I've given you here figures for on an index of the value of exports. So between 1920 and 1932, the average value of exports falls from 245 to just 86, and then rises very slowly to reach the 100 mark in 1938. Okay, so that is the most important set of statistics on this thing. It shows you that Britain's export markets, Britain's exports really are slashed in more than half during the 1920s and 1930s, and that is going to cause, again, widespread unemployment in those old export industries, export-orientated industries. Then some specific examples. You have here in the graph the example of the cotton industry. Again, this is mapped from 1860 through to 1950. So the point that you really need to get is from 1919 down to 1939. Okay, a slow, steady decline in the principal export industry of Britain. You also have the decline of the value of the key staple industries. And I'm talking here now coal and iron and steel. So this is not just, this is not the level of production, okay? This is the value of the coal and the iron and steel that is being produced. And again, this is now having to compete with the cheaper coal and iron and steel producers elsewhere. Where this is all leading to is to our friend who we haven't yet met, but we're briefly about to meet, John Maynard Keynes, and his attempt to try and put the British domestic economy back together again in the general theory, which we'll come to later. If the old staple industries of textiles, coal and iron and steel are having a hard time, the one bright spot, arguably, were the so-called new industries that emerged in the 1920s and 1930s. Anyone got an idea of what these new industries may have been? No? No one's going to have a wild guess, yeah? Automobiles are one of them, yeah? And what's the key feature of automobile production? Yeah, but how are they put together? Yes. Okay, assembly lines driven not by coal, not by steam, but by electricity. So you have the creation of new electrically powered assembly forms of mass production. And critically, for the new industries that emerged in Britain in the 1920s and 30s, many of them are available to semi-skilled labor. Okay? And we all know that when it comes to semi-skilled light manufacturing, the best workforce are women, because you don't have to pay them so much. Okay? So what you have in the 20s and 30s is a new set of industries in light manufacturing, electrical engineering, these types of areas, where women become both the producers, the people on the assembly line making the goods, like this woman making a wireless set, a radio, what you would call a radio. They become the producers, but they also are making goods that are aimed at women as consumers. Okay? Most of the new goods that are being made are basically consumer durables, or for the sort of household domestic market. They're things also that require electricity to work. So anyone can think of an idea of what these might be? A fridge, yeah. Pretty rudimentary fridges, but yeah, a refrigerator. Anything else? I know you're all going to go to the 50s, but don't try and think of your grandparents' house. Try and think of your grandparents' parents' house, which I know you're all very familiar with. Radios, yeah. Yeah. Sewing machines, very good. Electrical sewing machines. Anything else? Yeah. Washing machines, but washing machines come in very late in Britain. That's, like fridges. And the US gets them in the 20s and 30s. Britain gets them really in the 40s and the 50s. They're few. We're thinking much more humble things, much smaller scale things. We're talking about toasters. Yeah? We're talking about vacuums. We're talking about irons. Do you know what an iron is? Yeah? Just checking. We're talking about lino for the floor. How do you say that? Linoleum. I can't even say it. We're talking about tampons. We're talking about biscuits or cookies. We're talking about canned food. We're talking about cigarettes. We're talking about these types of goods. Now, it's estimated, and we don't have good figures in this, but it's estimated that there's something like 500,000 to 750,000 women working in these new industries. That's a tiny fraction of the total population of working women, which was about 6 million. So it's, certainly less. That is probably about, an eighth. But most of these women are, importantly, young and single. In 1931, of women that were working in, this is the entire population of working women, 77% of them were single, and 72% of them were between the ages of 15 and 34. And yet, women were much more represented in these new forms of production. Women as a total percentage of the workforce was about a third, but in these new industries they represented about a half of the total workforce. And it's geographically quite concentrated to London and the southeast and the Midlands. Indeed, London and the expanding affluence of the southeast was the main market for many of these new consumer durables that were being made. As we'll see next week, many people thought this was a sign of the emasculation of British industry, not a sign of its reanimation, but a sign of sort of decline, that now we only had work for women to do. Okay, now let's turn to the empire, because I've been talking about the attempt to, or the economy's collapse onto itself, to this sort of domestically orientated market, which would seem to fit in with my lecture last week about the return to the suburbs and to domestic life and to the countryside. But the empire, I'm going to suggest, remains central to this new, to the British economy. First of all, 1931, Britain coming off free trade, introducing the general tariff. What they also do is introduce a system of imperial preference. That is to say, they create an imperial trading bloc, where trade between members of the empire, of the dominions, primarily the dominions, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, South Africa, were not subject to protectionist tariffs. And they created this new currency unit called the sterling area. So all of these countries now became part of a sterling area. They all traded in sterling. And this was the attempt to bolster the value of the pound over the increasingly resurgent dollar, to try and hook these imperial countries into bolstering the British currency. So one consequence of this, as you can see, is that the dependence upon exports to the empire increases. And these figures are from 1922 to 1938.